Back live with you tonight here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. The Cabinet recently endorsed government's decision to impose restrictions on the export of scrap metal for 6 months. The decision comes with a host of measures that include a ban on cash transactions on scrap metals. The initiative, proposed by the Trade and Industry and Competition Department, follows rampant theft and vandalism at times, plunging the country into darkness. Cabinet's decision comes into effect today, and joining us now for reaction is Donald Mackay, who is an advisor to the Metal Recyclers Association. Donald, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Sure.
It's no longer a question of a proposal. Now it is basically law in the country, at least for the next 6 months, the restriction and the regulation of metal waste, recyclable metals and semi-finished products. The objective here being government trying to deal with the serious challenge that emanates from the theft of metals from public infrastructure, including the country's electricity, as I've mentioned, and also the rail transportation network. Are they going about it the right way?
Well, it's a relief that they didn't ban everything that they originally proposed, which went considerably beyond scrap metal. No, I'm not sure it does work. Their primary target now is really two products, scrap copper, but we haven't exported scrap copper in any kind of volume since 2013. So I'm not sure that that's going to go very far. Most of what falls within that ban are things like brass taps and plumbing fittings and that kind of thing. And then steel, but the steel that you can export is steel that's an offcut out of a manufacturing process. But if you've got an old fridge or something like that that you're getting rid of, then that can't be exported. So these are the only two categories that are covered by the ban for 6 months. We don't touch on, for example, the melted copper. So if you took the cable and you melted it down, that you can still export. You just can't export it as a cable. And then they've stopped individuals from selling copper cable, and they are proposing to ban the trade in cash for scrap metal, which I think is a really good idea, but it's taken quite a long time to get to this point. So I'm not sure why there was such a large delay.
Now, the arguments that were brought against this was the fact that this could possibly harm this essential economic sector that contributes to a more sustainable circular economy, and some legitimate businesses might be restricted to export, which will harm, I suppose, those particular businesses. And you're saying now the number has been limited compared to the products that were previously going to be banned. Will the same kind of effect or impact be felt by the industry?
Yeah, so I think the impact would have to be less than on what was proposed. It's still quite difficult to assess exactly how big the impact will be. I think the folk that are probably going to feel the pain the most here, as is always the case, are the people like the waste pickers, who are somewhat restricted in what they can now trade. And of course, by restricting the products that they trade in most commonly, and this is not copper, by the way, which is a relatively small part of their basket of stuff. But if we have a look at cutting their income, then of course that's a horrible situation. But it's a little too early to be able to quantify exactly how this will fall across the different sectors.
Do the policymakers have other options for regulating this particular sector? In fact, other programs for theft prevention?
Yeah, so I'm still not properly understanding how the theft problem is going to be adequately addressed. They certainly do make some good recommendations, better registration requirements, for example, with the police, if you are going to deal in scrap metal. But the registration problem is still fraught with issues. For example, you register at your local police station, but we don't have a central database where everyone is on. So it becomes very difficult to be able to check, for example, if someone is selling you scrap, are they properly registered? We don't have anything like a central registration point. So those sorts of things I think would go a long way, and they don't seem to be contained in this proposal.
And Donald, I mean, in what are we likely to see, in your view, in the next 6 months with this particular ban?
Well, I mean, I obviously hope the theft does go down. I'm not sure how the ban is going to assist that happening. But weirdly enough, they say, look, if the theft isn't down after 6 months, rather than saying maybe what we did is wrong, we'll just extend it for a longer period. So I am a little concerned that we're not really looking properly at, we're kind of assuming here that the problem is the exports of these products. Whereas, like I'd mentioned earlier, we're dealing, if you just take the copper and you melt it down, then all of these constraints simply disappear and you can trade it. Now, they are putting additional restrictions on some of the products, which is good. So you do need to get a permit for that product, for example. And you now need to get a permit to import something like a tabletop furnace, which you can melt in. So all of those things, I think, are good steps. But, if I have a shredder now, or I have a furnace in my house or in my back garden, I'm certainly not having to register that with anyone. So it's good to stop and control the influx, but we still don't have control over where all of these are currently situated. So I think the emphasis is heavily on the trade side, and I think a little light on the crime side of all of this.
So if you were to advise them, would you say strengthen custom controls and export enforcement to reduce this illicit trade?
Well, I'm not convinced that exporting is what's creating the problem here. There's very little evidence that the product is leaving in volume that is being exported, except in the processed form. So if you think about it, if I was to go and steal a cable, what I should do is melt the cable down. The minute I can do that, I can move that product around absolutely freely. And so I think what we've done is we've made it understandably difficult to export the cable, except that we're not exporting any cables. And we haven't made it particularly difficult to melt the product down and do something with the melted product. So I would recommend that tighter control be imposed on smelting operations, where I think a lot of the mischief is probably happening.
Got you loud and clear. Much appreciated. Thanks for coming on. That is Donald Mackay there, an advisor to the Metal Recyclers Association, following, of course, the announcement earlier on that a 6-month ban will be imposed on export of copper scrap as South Africa seeks to combat theft and sabotage to critical infrastructure like the rail network as well as electricity.